Tonight, in the quiet city of Forest Park, Georgia, tragedy struck in a way no one expected. It was a night that began like any other, but it ended in heartbreak, in confusion, and in a fight for justice that has yet to fade. This is the story of Amiya Cunningham, a young woman who had her whole life ahead of her, until a single devastating moment changed everything forever. Amiya was just 25 years old. To her loved ones, she was vibrant, full of love, and overflowing with promise. She was not just another face in the crowd. She was a daughter, a friend, a companion to many, a young woman with dreams that were finally within reach. But one violent crash on a Forest Park roadway stole all of that, and the shock of that night still lingers, haunting everyone who knew her, and even those who only came to know her name after her death. At first, it seemed like a tragic accident. Car crashes happen every day across America. They leave families shattered. They raise questions of fate, chance, and timing. But as investigators began piecing the scene together, this collision proved to be something more than just a random misfortune. Authorities pointed to another driver, Alexandria Larkin. Within hours, the quiet city learned that this was no ordinary wreck. This was a life-ending event that carried with it allegations of reckless decisions, accountability, and the crushing weight of choices that cannot be undone. The community struggled to process the loss. Candlelight vigils lit up the nights following the crash. Friends, family, and neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder, holding flickering candles against the darkness, refusing to let Amiya's story be reduced to a headline or a statistic. They spoke her name again and again, as if saying it aloud could protect her memory from slipping away. In their grief, they found determination to seek justice, to make sure those responsible would answer for the role they played in taking her life. This case is more than paperwork in a courtroom. It is more than a line in a police report. It is the reminder that life can be taken in an instant, not by fate alone, but by human hands and human choices. What happened on that road in Forest Park is a story of how quickly joy can be stolen, how recklessness can destroy futures, and how grief can transform into a demand for justice. And so tonight, we will walk through Amiya's story. We will hear about the young woman she was, the crash that took her, the investigation that followed, and the voices that still cry out for her to be remembered. If stories like these matter to you, if you believe victims deserve to be remembered, then don't just scroll past. Hit subscribe. Don't let Amiya's name fade into silence. This is not just the story of a crash, this is the story of Amiya Cunningham. To understand the depth of this tragedy, we must first understand who Amiya Cunningham was. She was not a statistic. She was not just a victim of a crash. She was a young woman full of life, standing at the edge of her future. At 25 years old, Amiya was described by everyone around her as warm, generous, and full of energy. Friends say she had a smile that could light up a room. Family members recall how she always put others before herself, how she carried an ambition to do something meaningful with her life, and how she seemed to have an unshakable bond with those she loved most. Amiya's days were filled with simple joys and big dreams. She cherished time with her family, laughing during gatherings, making plans for the future and sharing her heart freely. She was part of a close-knit circle that adored her. For them, Amiya was more than a daughter or a cousin. She was a bright light, someone who always seemed destined for more. Her story was supposed to unfold slowly, with chapters of success, love, and joy still ahead. But fate, and more importantly, another person's actions, cut that story short. To understand the other side of this case, we must also introduce the woman at the center of the allegations, Alexandria Larkin. Not much was widely known about her before the crash, but her name would soon become tied forever to Amiya's. Investigators and reporters began asking questions. Who was she? What led her onto that road that night? What decisions did she make that placed her on a collision course with Amiya's life? Alexandria was quickly identified as the driver believed to be responsible for the deadly crash. And though her full background remained largely private, the public wanted answers. They wanted to know what could push someone to make the kinds of reckless choices that end with a young woman losing everything. The setting of this tragedy is also important. Forest Park, Georgia, is not a place known for violent headlines. It is a small, quiet city, tucked away with its neighborhoods, schools, and businesses. People there often describe it as a community where life moves at a steady pace. Streets are lined with modest homes, trees shading sidewalks, and families making their lives in peace. But that peace was interrupted on the night of the crash. Suddenly, those calm streets became the scene of devastation. The shock spread quickly. In places where people once felt safe, there was now unease. A community that had been used to ordinary days was now forced to confront the fragility of life in a way they never expected. For Forest Park, this wasn't just another tragic accident. It was something that shook the very sense of safety and routine. By looking at Amiya's life, at Alexandria's role, and at the place where this tragedy occurred, we begin to see how layered this case really is. It is not just about two women who crossed paths on a road. It is about the weight of choices, the cost of recklessness, and the devastation left behind when lives are cut short. Amiya's story is now woven into the history of Forest Park, a reminder that behind every headline lies a real person with a life, a family, and dreams that should have been allowed to grow. And this is where the story turns darker, when what looked like an accident began to unfold as something much more serious. On that fateful night in Forest Park, Georgia, everything seemed ordinary, until it wasn't. The roads were calm, the city settling into its usual rhythm, but hidden in the shadows of routine, a collision was about to tear through the lives of two families and leave a community stunned. It was late when Amiya Cunningham got behind the wheel. She was not reckless, she was not careless, she was simply driving, like thousands of others do every day, never knowing that danger can be just around the corner. At nearly the same time, Alexandria Larkin was also on the road. What happened next was sudden, violent, and irreversible. The crash was not minor. It was not one of those fender benders people shake off and walk away from. Witnesses recall the sound, the screeching tires, the violent metal-on-metal impact that echoed through the streets like an explosion. It was the kind of sound that forces you to stop what you're doing, to look outside, to wonder if someone survived. When first responders arrived, they found Amiya's vehicle shattered, the damage severe. The kind of damage that told its own story long before words were spoken. Amiya was gravely injured, and despite every effort to save her, her life could not be spared. At just 25, her future ended in that instant, on a road she had traveled before, in a city she called home. Alexandria Larkin, the other driver, was quickly identified at the scene. Authorities began asking the hard questions. Was she speeding? Was she under the influence? Was she distracted? What decisions had she made that turned a routine drive into a deadly collision? Investigators would later reveal that the evidence pointed directly to her responsibility. What should have been just another night ended with a young woman gone forever and another woman placed in handcuffs. The community did not take the news lightly. In the hours following the crash, word spread across Forest Park. Phone calls were made, texts lit up screens. Families rushed to confirm what they had heard. Could it really be true? Could Amiya, so full of life, so young, really be gone? At the crash site, glass and twisted metal were left behind, but more than that, a silence settled in. For those who came upon the scene after the fact, it was impossible to ignore the gravity. This was not just an accident, it was a loss that carried the weight of human decisions, choices that could have been avoided, choices that would never be undone. The city was shaken. Those who knew Amiya were consumed with grief. Those who did not know her personally still felt the impact because the story spread quickly, capturing headlines and sparking questions about accountability. People asked how something like this could happen in their own community, on their own streets. And while the wreckage was cleared and the road reopened, the damage was permanent. A life was gone, and a family was forever altered. What unfolded in those few seconds was the moment when the ordinary became devastating, when the future of a young woman was stolen in a way that no one could ever prepare for. But the crash itself was only the beginning. The days that followed would bring investigation, anger, and the start of a fight for justice that continues to echo even now. In the hours after the crash that claimed the life of 25-year-old Amiya Cunningham, investigators were left with a haunting scene. The roadway told its own story. Shattered glass reflected the streetlights, twisted metal blocked the lanes, and skid marks cut into the asphalt like scars that would never fully fade. For detectives, this was not just debris, it was evidence, and every fragment mattered. The Forest Park Police Department began piecing together the chain of events. Witnesses stepped forward, their voices still shaking as they described what they had seen. Some reported the sound first, a thunderous impact that forced them out of their homes to witness the wreckage. Others recalled seeing Alexandria Larkin's vehicle moments before the collision, moving with a speed and recklessness that stood out against the otherwise calm night. First responders worked desperately at the scene. They tried everything they could to save Amiya, but the injuries were too severe. For officers, the urgency shifted quickly, from rescue to investigation. They examined the vehicles, took photographs, measured the distance of the skid marks, and spoke to anyone willing to share what they had seen or heard. Every detail was crucial in determining whether this was simply a tragic accident or something far more serious. Very soon, suspicion began to focus on Alexandria Larkin. She was taken into custody, but the questions didn't stop there. Was she intoxicated? Was she distracted by her phone? Was she driving recklessly in a way that showed disregard for human life? Toxicology tests were ordered. Officers searched for security cameras nearby that might have captured the crash or her driving beforehand. In cases like these, small details can mean the difference between a charge of negligence and a charge that carries the weight of a life lost. As news spread, the public became restless. Forest Park is not a large city. Word of Amiya's death traveled quickly, and within hours, social media filled with tributes, condolences, and outrage. Friends described Amiya as someone who never deserved such an ending. Strangers, who had never met her, expressed anger at the thought that her death may have been preventable. Investigators were under pressure. The family demanded answers. The community demanded accountability. In press releases, officials assured the public that no stone would be left unturned, that the truth of what happened that night would come out, no matter how difficult. Behind the scenes, teams reconstructed the accident, running calculations to determine speed, force of impact, and whether Alexandria's actions directly caused Amiya's death. But beyond the science and reports lay something more human. Detectives who spoke with Amiya's family described their grief as overwhelming. Parents who had to identify their daughter, siblings who could not believe the calls they were receiving, friends who replayed the last time they had spoken to her, wishing they had said more. Their pain added urgency to the work of investigators who knew they were not only building a case, they were holding together a family's hope for justice. And so, the investigation moved forward. Each witness statement, each piece of evidence, and each official report painted a clearer picture. Amiya Cunningham's death was not just tragic, it was criminal. The question was no longer if someone would be held responsible, but how and when the weight of justice would fall. But as the case headed toward the courts, the stakes grew even higher. What unfolded in the courtroom would not only determine Alexandria Larkin's future, but would also test whether Amiya's family's cries for justice would finally be answered. When the investigation was complete, all eyes turned toward the courthouse. The crash that ended the life of 25-year-old Amiya Cunningham was no longer just a police matter. It had become a legal battle, one that would determine whether Alexandria Larkin would be held fully accountable for her role in the deadly collision. The courtroom in Forest Park filled with heavy silence on the first day of proceedings. Amiya's family sat together in the gallery, holding photographs of her, clinging to one another for strength. Across the aisle sat Alexandria, the woman authorities claimed was responsible. The contrast was striking, one side consumed by grief, the other facing the weight of criminal charges. Prosecutors presented their case with precision. They began by showing the jury what investigators had uncovered: the skid marks on the asphalt, the crumpled frame of Amiya's car, the autopsy reports detailing the severity of her injuries. Each detail painted the same picture: that Amiya's death had not been unavoidable, that choices made by Alexandria Larkin led directly to that violent moment on the road. Witnesses were called to the stand. Neighbors described what they heard the night of the crash: the terrible screech of brakes, the deafening impact, the sirens that followed. First responders testified about what they saw when they arrived: the desperate attempts to save Amiya, and the state of Alexandria's vehicle. Some witnesses spoke of seeing her driving recklessly before the collision, observations that strengthened the prosecution's argument. The defense worked to counter these claims. Alexandria's attorneys argued that the crash was a tragic accident, not a crime. They insisted that circumstances beyond her control played a role, that it was unfair to suggest she intended harm. They questioned the reliability of witnesses, highlighted gaps in the investigation, and sought to frame Alexandria as someone caught in an unfortunate situation rather than a reckless offender. But Amiya's family sat through it all, their pain visible to the jury. The sight of her parents holding each other as evidence was displayed spoke louder than words. The prosecution reminded the jury again and again that this was not just about twisted metal or broken laws. It was about a young woman whose life had been stolen, and about the accountability owed to her memory. The trial drew media attention, and soon headlines carried updates across Georgia. For many in Forest Park, this was more than a legal case. It was a test of whether the justice system would deliver for a grieving family, or whether excuses would overshadow responsibility. When closing arguments were made, the jury was left with a choice: to view the crash as a preventable crime or as an unfortunate accident. Hours of deliberation followed, each second weighing heavily on Amiya's loved ones. Finally, the verdict was read. The jury found Alexandria Larkin guilty. The room fell silent before gasps and quiet cries filled the air. For Amiya's family, it was not victory. It could never bring her back, but it was a step toward justice. Alexandria was sentenced, her future forever changed, just as she had changed Amiya's. The trial was over, but the impact of its outcome would ripple far beyond the courtroom walls, leaving behind questions, lessons, and grief that no sentence could ever erase. When the trial concluded and the sentence was handed down, many believed the story of Amiya Cunningham had reached its end. But for those who loved her, and for the community of Forest Park, the aftermath carried its own weight. Justice in the courtroom did not mean closure. Instead, it marked the beginning of a long journey of grief, remembrance, and reflection on what her loss truly meant. In the days following the verdict, candlelight vigils returned. Family, friends, and neighbors gathered once again, this time not only to mourn but also to honor Amiya's memory. Photographs of her were placed on makeshift memorials, flowers lined the streets near the crash site, and voices rose together in prayer and determination. They spoke her name, shared stories about her kindness, and promised that she would never be forgotten. For the community, the vigils were more than ceremonies. They were acts of resistance against the silence that often follows tragedies, once headlines fade. Her family pushed forward with advocacy. They spoke at community meetings about the dangers of reckless driving, urging stricter enforcement and more awareness. They reminded everyone that Amiya's death was not just an isolated event, but part of a larger pattern where poor decisions behind the wheel devastate lives. In their grief, they sought to prevent another family from enduring the same pain. Their campaign was not about revenge, but about protecting others from walking the same path of loss. For many in Forest Park, the case sparked a broader conversation. Was enough being done to address reckless driving? Were penalties harsh enough to discourage it? Should laws be re-examined to ensure accountability in cases like Amiya's? These discussions revealed just how deeply the community had been shaken. The quiet city, once content in its routines, now faced hard questions about safety, justice, and responsibility. But alongside the aftermath came speculation. Some questioned whether the full truth had been uncovered. Was Alexandria Larkin's recklessness fueled by something more than just poor judgment? Did intoxication, distraction, or hidden personal issues play a role? While the trial had provided one version of events, theories continued to circulate. Some believed the case was more complex than presented in court, that details may have been left unsaid or unexplored. Others wondered whether leniency had played any part in the sentencing, given the devastating outcome. For Amiya's family, however, the theories mattered less than the reality. Their daughter, their sister, their friend was gone. No speculation could bring her back. No explanation could ease the emptiness left behind. They carried her memory with them in every gathering, every conversation, and every quiet moment when her absence was felt most. The aftermath of Amiya's death is a reminder that tragedies do not end in courtrooms. The pain lingers in the lives of those left behind, in the communities forever marked by loss, and in the questions that remain long after verdicts are read. Forest Park moved forward, but it was never the same. Amiya's story became a lasting part of its history, a symbol of how fragile life is and how critical it is to hold one another accountable for the choices we make. And yet, even in the shadow of grief, her family held on to one truth. They would continue to speak her name, to honor her, and to make sure that her story lived on no matter how much time passed. Time has a way of moving forward, but grief rarely follows the same pace. In the months after the sentencing, Amiya Cunningham's loved ones discovered that healing was not a straight path. It was jagged, unpredictable, and often cruel. Each holiday, each birthday, each milestone without her deepened the weight of her absence. For her mother, walking past Amiya's empty bedroom became a daily reminder of what had been stolen. For her siblings, even the smallest joys felt incomplete, overshadowed by the thought that she was no longer there to share them. The community, too, continued to feel her absence. Schools held moments of silence, pastors wove her story into sermons, and local organizations began advocating for safer streets in her name. They pushed for initiatives like speed bumps, traffic cameras, and stricter penalties for reckless driving. "If Amiya's death can save even one life," her father said in a televised interview, "then her story will not have been in vain." Those words became a rallying cry, not just for the family, but for many who had once felt powerless against the rising tide of preventable tragedies. But the shadows of that night lingered in other ways too. For those who knew Alexandria Larkin, the driver responsible, there was a difficult truth to confront. Some had seen her as a friend, a classmate, a neighbor, someone who, until that fateful night, lived an ordinary life. Her reckless choice did not only destroy Amiya's future, it destroyed her own. From behind prison walls, she reportedly struggled with guilt, writing letters that may never reach Amiya's family. Some said she cried every night, haunted by the memory of flashing lights, twisted metal, and the silence that followed. Others claimed she hardened, refusing to accept full responsibility, trapped in her own bitterness. These conflicting accounts sparked debate in Forest Park. Could remorse ever balance the scales of justice? Could one person's regret undo another's permanent loss? To Amiya's family, forgiveness was not impossible, but it was not yet within reach. Forgiveness, her aunt explained, is a process. We're not there yet. Maybe one day, but not today. And still, theories continued to swirl. Was Alexandria simply careless, or had something else been at play? Some speculated about alcohol, others about distraction from a phone or emotional turmoil. The court had settled on recklessness, but the unanswered questions left space for endless speculation. In that uncertainty, many found frustration, believing that Amiya's story deserved absolute clarity, not lingering doubt. Through it all, Amiya's memory was carefully preserved. Her social media pages turned into memorials, filled with heartfelt messages from friends and strangers alike. "I didn't know you," one person wrote, "but your story changed the way I think every time I get behind the wheel." Another posted, "You should still be here. I'll drive safer because of you." These messages became proof that her life, though cut short, continued to ripple outward, shaping choices and touching hearts she had never met. The aftermath of Amiya's death was not just about sorrow, it was about transformation. The city of Forest Park, once shaken, began to rebuild itself with a deeper awareness of responsibility. For every parent who told their child her story, for every driver who slowed down at a crosswalk, for every lawmaker who considered tougher reforms, Amiya's legacy endured. Her story had become larger than the tragedy itself. It became a reminder that life can vanish in an instant, and that justice, though imperfect, must always strive to protect the living while honoring the dead. And so, even as grief lingered like a shadow, Amiya Cunningham's name remained a light, guiding her family, her community, and all who remembered her toward a future where her loss might inspire change.